Hello there, my frightful little ghouls and goblins. Always a pleasure. I'm Taylor, and today we're taking a look at some of the most evil things ever done, all in the name of science. Every person on this list would make even the maddest scientists say, hey, take a step back. We're a far cry from Bill Nye. Now this list shook me to my core. I couldn't do it by myself. Couldn't bear it. So I had to bring in some help from my expert in all things evil, the most amazing Kennedy. Please welcome her to the channel.
Hey everybody, I'm so excited to be making my way onto the top 5 scary. Let's not waste any more time and get started.
Number 5, Yang Yungjin. Yang Yungjin is a controversial Chinese clinical psychiatrist, infamous for his practice of trying to treat internet addiction. Well, that almost sounds noble. Now, I definitely spend too much time on Twitter for my own good. What's so evil about getting people to spend more time in the real world? Well, it could be because of his methods, you know? Yang is a firm believer in electroconvulsive therapy, and if you're not familiar with that term, it's a fancy process in which surges of electricity are ran through a patient, inducing a small seizure to treat mental illness. So the way to treat people who are spending too much time on electronic devices is to hook them up to something electronic and let electricity run through their body painfully. Yeah, okay, no, I'm starting to understand where some of this controversy is coming from. Yang believes that people suffering from internet and gaming addiction suffer from personality disorders and need to be treated as such. His clinic doesn't really run like a regular clinic, but has been more closely described as a boot camp. Parents sign away their children into Yang's foster care, who then get sent to a prison-like environment of harsh treatments and cruel conditions. Yang would treat his patients in a military-like manner, punishing them with more treatments for misbehavior or rewarding patients who would act as informants against other patients. In addition to round-the-clock shockings, Yang would also administer medications to his patients without the consent of them or their parents by sneaking them in as diet supplements. Yang would punish patients who tried to get their parents to take them home with, well, you can probably take a guess, more shocks. Yang's practice has since been shut down, but in the time it operated, it's estimated that as many as 6,000 patients were exposed to cruel treatments by the doctor. Yang's controversial methods caught him international attention, even in pop culture. The popular multiplayer video game Dead by Daylight, in which players play a monster attacking a team of players trying to survive, featured a character actually inspired by Yang. In 2017, the development studio held a poll for Chinese players on suggestions for a Chinese monster, since the game was very big there. And Yang was a popular write-in vote, as obviously Chinese gamers would see him as a monster, leading the team to create a character who was a doctor who used electricity to shock his opponents. Releasing with him as well was a survivor named Feng Min, an esports pro serving as the doctor's nemesis, an internet-addicted patient, and a map set in a Chinese asylum to boot. Before the final release of the character though, the doctor was changed to an American backstory, presumably to avoid any possible pushback or controversy of comparison to the real doctor. But it's probably saying something if your audience considers you a monster on the level of Michael Myers and Freddy.
Next up at number 4, Dr. Sigmund Rascher. Known for his cruel contributions to the German army in World War II, Sigmund Rascher is among one of the worst scientists in human history. Sigmund's father was also a physician and an avid follower of Rudolf Steiner, an occultist and self-proclaimed clairvoyant. So naturally, Sigmund attended the first Waldorf school based on Rudolf Steiner's philosophies. He went on to study medicine in Munich and later worked for an internship in Switzerland with his father. But despite his upbringing, it seems he grew to align with some other ideologies, eventually joining the German paramilitary organization. And that is where his evil doings would begin. He denounced his father and soon became acquainted with the leader, asking for human subjects to be placed at his disposal. He made it clear the experiments could prove fatal, but that it would be required for accurate results. By 1942, he began conducting experiments in pressure chambers, where he would simulate a high altitude and then quickly alter the pressure to simulate the conditions of a pilot free falling with no oxygen. Allegedly, the leader mentioned that those who survived could be pardoned death at the camp, but Sigmund talked him out of it, stating that they didn't deserve any amnesty. Further, he conducted cruel freezing experiments on 300 prisoners, allegedly to figure out the best way to warm up soldiers who experienced hypothermia. He would either force his victims to remain outdoors completely naked in freezing temperatures for up to 14 hours, or would place them in tanks of ice water for 3 hours, measuring their pulse and internal temperatures all the while. From there, they would try to warm up the victims, usually with water, but experimented using a variety of different temperatures, including boiling, and this would often cause further harm. Along with his other forms of torture under the guise of science, Sigmund would administer polygal, a substance to aid blood clotting, and then shoot or amputate a limb on his victim to see the speed at which they would bleed out. But I will let you know, he eventually did get what was coming to him after years of falsified facts from botched experiments, as well as killing his own lab assistant. Sigmund was executed under the order of the leader, and in 1990 his experiments were ruled inhumane and criminal on top of containing falsified data.
Number 3. Albert Kligman. Right off the top, I just feel like this guy's got an evil scientist name. Kligman just, I don't know, hits the ear wrong. Well, he was guilty of a lot more than a scary sounding name. Dr. Kligman was a dermatologist who was contracted by Dow Corning, Johnson & Johnson, and the US Army to research the effects of chemical compounds on human skin. Being offered a modest 10 grand in grant money, Kligman set out to work right away, finding a bevy of inmates of Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison, where he would experiment on thousands of inmates with little to no regard for the prisoners' safety or long-term health. It was documented that the experiments at Holmesburg prison entailed a delightful assortment of things like hair transplants, implantation of foreign bodies, burns and radiation of the skin, exposure to dioxin, application and ingestion of toxic materials, and near lethal doses of acne medicine, and the yanking of fingernails to round it off. Delightful. One of the chemicals Kligman exposed his test subject to that I mentioned earlier, dioxin, was the main contaminant in Agent Orange, the controversial chemical agent used in the Vietnam War by the Americans. Kligman was being paid to research the effects of dioxin on skin, and suffice it to say, it is not pleasant remotely. I hope there's a picture of something disgusting behind me. Inmates would be scarred, left sick, with permanently disfigured skin conditions leading to painful long-term side effects. Oftentimes as well, many subjects were exposed to all sorts of contaminants and other infections from the unsafe conditions of his experiments. Most of his inmates were bribed by financial compensation, ranging anywhere from $30 to $50 for smaller experiments, or $800 for some of the more extreme cases. This small bit of cash was really appealing enough to attract a constant supply of victims, prisoners, who had very little in the way of funds. This allowed them to get a little bit of freedom, a little bit of power within the prison, but also let them have a bit of hope that maybe they'd one day pay off their bail. Kligman destroyed many of the notes from his research, but through testaments from his victims, we know the truth of what he got up to. While there have been many attempts to get justice after the fact for what the inmates experienced, Kligman himself lived to the ripe old age of 93 and never faced any sort of consequences for his actions whatsoever. In fact, he was thrilled by the opportunity. Listen to this quote from Kligman describing how he felt setting up shop at the prison. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." That sounds made up. That sounds like horror movie bad guy dialogue. That sounds like something Jigsaw would say. But no, it was a real guy who was allowed to experiment on a lot of real people.
Next up is Shiro Ishii, a notorious microbiologist and surgeon during the War of Resistance, a conflict between China and Japan in the 30s and 40s. Shiro Ishii led the development and application of biological warfare for the infamous Unit 731, and is truly an evil scientist if I've ever heard of one. Prior to his evil experiments, he was actually known as a pretty brilliant man. He had a photogenic memory and studied medicine at the Kyoto Imperial University. But despite his highly credible grades, he was not known to get along well with his classmates. During his studies, he was known to grow bacteria in petri dishes and refer to them as his pets, a practice that made many uncomfortable as they felt he was treating the bacteria as more of a companion than a research subject. Potentially the first red flag in what would become a sea of evil and horrendous experiments. By 1927, Ishii was advocating for the creation of a bioweapons program, something that was against the Geneva Convention at the time, but did not yet have enough power within his unit to make it happen. But in 1936, he was promoted to senior army surgeon and given full control over Unit 731, a decision I can only assume is regretted to this day. In these facilities, with no one to tell him no, Ishii decided to unleash his evil experiments on live humans, as he believed he could not get the results he was looking for by testing on animals. Ishii was notorious for injecting his subjects with deadly diseases under the guise of vaccines so that he could watch and study the effects if left untreated, leaving his victims suffering horrifying symptoms and eventually letting them die. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. Victims of his evil experiments would also have limbs amputated and reattached to other parts of their bodies while conscious and without the use of any anesthesia. Or they'd be put into pressure chambers until their eyes literally escaped their skulls. It's estimated that nearly 10,000 people died at the hands of Shiro Ishii's cruel experiments, but perhaps most insane of all is that after the war ended, he was never charged with any war crimes, as he traded the information he obtained in his experiments for immunity and then lived out the remainder of his life in Japan a free man. And last up, we have Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow was an American psychologist during the 30s to the 50s, and although he didn't experiment on people, he is widely regarded as cruel and unethical for his experiments on monkeys. Harlow had one big question: what was the meaning of love? Initially it started as an earnest study looking at the bond between a mother and her offspring, and early on it did actually provide psychologists with some valuable information about the importance of connection in those early years. But Harlow soon became obsessed and began blurring the lines of ethical experimentation until soon he was nothing more than a monster. What was once about discovering the importance of early stage bonding morphed into long-term isolation and the mental effects it had on the monkeys. Harlow and his team had what they literally called the pits of despair, I kid you not, where the test subjects would be isolated without any contact, including the smells and sounds of other monkeys, for up to a year. The results of his experiment were severely damaged monkeys who, as he described, were obliterated socially. After being released from isolation, many refused to eat, and some ended up dying from starvation. Autopsies would show the monkeys were actively choosing not to eat, causing some to believe that he had actually driven the animals to such bad mental states that they no longer wanted to be alive. Over the years, he got the name monkey torturer, as on top of extended isolation, he would also actually force the monkeys to mate using an archaic device. However, because he was conducting such experiments prior to the Animal Welfare Act of 1966, not only did he not face any repercussions, he was actually awarded for his findings and highly celebrated among many in his industry. This doesn't mean he went uncriticized for his unethical treatment. Some of the students that worked in Harlow's unit at the university have come forward saying that they had nightmares of the experiments being conducted and couldn't wait until he retired to shut down the entire operation. Others said that anybody with respect for life would find this offensive, and all he left was one huge mess to clean up. Later, Harlow went on to say in a 1974 interview, "I don't really like animals. I despise cats, I hate dogs, how could you like a monkey?" So, despite looking for the meaning of love, it seems he was more interested in torturing innocent monkeys and causing irreversible harm.
That's all for this video, my little ghouls and goblins. Thanks so much for joining us.
I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked this video and you want to see a little more of me, head over to the most amazing top 10. I can't wait to see you there.